Okay, hi. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and this is the Digital Economy Lab lunch seminar. Our speaker today is David Deming. David joins us from the Harvard Kennedy School, where he's the Isabel and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy. He's also the faculty dean at Kirkland House at Harvard College and a research associate at the NBER. His research focuses on higher education, economic inequality, skills, technology, and the future of the labor market. He recently co-founded the Skills Lab, which creates performance-based measures of soft skills such as teamwork and decision-making. And he writes occasional columns in The Atlantic and has a Substack newsletter called Fork Lightning. So for our seminar, we welcome and encourage questions during the seminar. If you're in the Zoom audience, there's that little Q&A button function down at the bottom of the screen. Use that one. For those of you who are here at Stanford, just raise your hand when I call on you or someone calls on you, and we'll bring the microphone over to you for that. So with that, David, welcome to Stanford, and please tell us about the possible labor market impacts of AI.
All right, thanks, Eric, and thanks everybody for coming. It's really great to be here to talk to you all about AI. As Eric said, I'm a labor economist, and the challenge we face when trying to forecast the possible labor market impacts of AI is that it's a pretty new technology and it's just kind of happening as we speak. And so that's why I call it the possible impacts. I'm going to tell you how I think about it. I'm going to give you some early evidence, both on the micro and macro side, and then we'll go from there. And I'm excited to give this talk and also to take questions. I know the usual norm is clarifying questions, and that's fine. But if you have a question that's not quite clarifying, that's fine too. I'm very used to, economist rules, which is, blood sport seminars. That's fine. So just ask me questions if you want. Okay. So here's the outline of the talk. I'm really going to talk about two different papers. Okay. So one of them is a paper called The Rapid Adoption of Generative AI by me and Alex Bick and Adam Blandon. And this is micro evidence on worker AI usage. Basically, we conducted a nationally representative survey of generative AI usage, and I'm going to tell you about it in a second, to get a sense of to what extent is this technology being adopted right now by people? What are they using it for? Who's using it more? Who's using it less? And things like that, just to get an early sense of what's happening. And then I'm going to talk about a paper called Technological Disruption in the Labor Market. This is a joint work with Chris Ong and Larry Summers. And this paper is really a macro view about AI and to do two things. One is to take the long run view. So how have past major technological disruptions affected the labor market? So when the economy got electrified, or when farming was mechanized, or when the personal computer hit the labor market in the 1970s and 80s, how did that change the labor market as a way to say, well, if AI is in that class of technologies, as many people think it is, can we learn anything about the past to project going forward? And then I'll show you some macro evidence, meaning just big evidence in the labor market that actually, in some ways, AI has already affected the labor market in ways that are measurable in the data. So I'll talk about that. And then last, we'll conclude with some irresponsible speculation. Okay, hopefully we have time for that. Okay, so first is the micro evidence. We measure generative AI use in a survey we call the Real-Time Population Survey. We call it that because it is a survey that is designed specifically to mimic the current population survey, which is the most important and widely used survey of labor market activity in the US. So the CPS is the source of the jobs report every month, local labor market conditions. The Bureau of Labor Statistics releases this much anticipated report that moves markets and gives us a state of the unemployment rate and job growth and things like that. And so what we did was construct a relatively large sample of about 5,000 people, online survey that mimics the exact structure of the CPS. Okay, so that means same questions in the same order, asked the same way. And we do that so that we could benchmark our results to the CPS and kind of mimic the idea that what if the CPS added a module on generative AI use, what would you expect to see? We want you to think about our survey as that. So I'm going to show you some evidence that you should think about it that way and then show you what we found. Okay, so we originally fielded the survey through the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And just to give you a high-level overview before I get into the details, we contracted it with a private survey company that themselves contract with a bunch of different owners of survey panels, about 15 million people collectively, and they sample from that, and then you can give them quotas, and you basically give them the exact question ordering and structure and tell them to ask it in the same way. And I won't get into all the details, but basically, you really ought to think about this as a replica of the CPS, okay? And I'll try to convince you that's true. And then I'll show you a little bit of evidence in a second here that Adam and Alex previously used this design to measure other important things like the labor market in the pandemic, how things were changing, how rapidly they were changing, and also things like work from home. So this is a tried and true strategy we are now applying to AI. Okay, so and And it's important to do it this way because then you can ask the question, well, do we get the same answer as the CPS on things we know? We think of the CPS as ground truth. And the real-time population survey, you're asking the same questions. Do you get the same measurement of hours worked? Do you get the same measurement of the unemployment rate and things like that? And if you do, you can be more confident that the survey is representative. Okay, so let me show you a couple things on that. This is from a paper by Bick and Blandon a year ago, where they were comparing the CPS and the RPS to 2 other surveys. So 4 different measures of a very simple question, which is, are you employed? Okay, and over time, they measure this in the pandemic. So you can see the CPS up here has this measure of the employment rate prior to the pandemic. And then in March, when everything shut down, you see in the CPS, the employment rate dropped from about 70% to like 57% in a month. Okay, and what you see is these surveys, the RPS, which is in blue, that's the survey we're using, and then the Understanding America survey and the Census Pulse survey, which is administered by the Census Bureau, are all tracking the same thing. And with the exception of the UAS, which is a private survey administered at USC, they all track the trajectory of employment after the pandemic very closely. Okay, so the CPS and the RPS are lining up very well, and they also line up with the Census Pulse survey. And then you can look at another thing, which is even harder to measure, which is you ask people, how many hours did you work last week? And on this same measure, the RPS does very well. It aligns very closely to pretty detailed fluctuations in hours worked in the CPS. Okay, so this is all giving us confidence that our survey, and we're not waiting on this, we're not asking people and then waiting. This is not by construction. This is actually in the data. The people we ask have similar employment patterns, and as I'll show you in a second, earnings patterns to what we see in the CPS. Okay. And then we can also benchmark it to external things. So this is something they did in a previous paper. They were interested in work from home, and so they asked the question, how does our measure of the change in commuting patterns compare to objective data from Google mobility trends, like workplace visits? And so what you see on the left is the log change relative to the baseline. So you want to interpret this as relative to the pandemic, you saw a decline of close to 70% in commuting volume right after the pandemic that reverted back to like 30%, but never quite recovered. This is the persistence of work from home. And when you benchmark that in the RPS, they asked a similar question about, how much time do you spend, how many days do you commute, do you work from home, et cetera. You find a very similar magnitude of it, both the down and then the bounce back up is very similar in the 2 data sources. And then you can also compare the RPS to the CPS in terms of how much time are people spending working from home. So the point of all this is to convince you that this approach, and the RPS in particular, is a good way to mimic public, widely used surveys. Okay? And so then we want to ask questions about generative AI. So again, we're asking all the same questions the RPS always does. We are asking all the questions the CPS normally does, benchmarking to the CPS, waiting if necessary to make our survey exactly representative of the CPS sample, and then asking some questions the CPS doesn't ask. Okay? And the point of all this is to say, well, we don't just have some random convenience sample, we have a sample that we think is arguably nationally representative the way the CPS is. So we really want to get a baseline for how frequently people are using generative AI and who's using it and what are they using it for. Okay, so that's the thing I'm hopefully convincing you of. So we launched a pilot survey in June of about 2,500 people. In the paper, we don't report results from the pilot survey, but they're actually very similar. Actually, if you squint, it looks like there's an slight increase in usage over time, but we didn't ask all the same questions. We basically made the survey better, and so we're really just reporting the August wave, but you can see all the results for the June wave in the appendix of the paper if you want. We surveyed about 5,000 people in August, and that's the main sample I'm reporting information about. And actually, we fielded a wave in November that's actually right now in the field. Added some questions. Happy to talk about this later. But we added some questions, more detailed questions than we currently asked about time use and intensity of use and the way people use it. And we're also doing talking with David about this, we're doing some elicitation of willingness to pay. So asking people how much they value the technology and a few other things that we're excited about. We're basically going to launch this. We're going to be doing the survey quarterly is the hope, and trying to track generative AI usage in the economy over time. And if any of you have good ideas for questions we could ask, send them my way. This is very much something we're still figuring out how to do better. Okay, so, and the other thing we want to do is we want to benchmark to subscription. So we're asking detailed questions about, do you have a ChatGPT Plus subscription or whatever, to try to see if our measures look like what we know from data from these companies. Okay. So I won't show you all the results on this. But again, because we, in the survey, we told people we want certain quotas of demographics, we almost by construction can match the CPS pretty closely on things like age, race, ethnicity, gender, education, marital status, number of children, the region of the country. We get very close alignment on all those things, but we also don't match on some other things. So we can look at the data and say, does it actually match up to things we didn't attach quotas to? Do you have a question, Eric? Yeah. Yeah.
So you can match on observables.
Yep.
And then we had this election where a lot of people pointed out that the people who respond within a demographic group were different than the people who didn't respond. There's some other unobservable characteristic. I guess I'll get into it more when you get into the other results, but is there anything you want to say about the sort of the unobserved heterogeneity and the types of people who respond to surveys and the people who don't?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that actually applies to all surveys, right? So this could also be happening in the CPS. So there's a deeper question of, is the CPS actually representative? I don't know the answer. I think it's hard to know for sure. We did do some things I'll show you in a second. We're trying to show you, do our results look similar to other surveys that have different constructions? So for example, ours is an internet survey. There are some panels where they do a probability sample based on mailing addresses, and we find pretty similar results to those, like Pew is one that does that. And so all we can really do is say, do we find something that seems reasonable given what others have found and given the approach we're taking? But I mean, you're right that it could be that the people who aren't using generative, they're totally off the grid. You know, something like 97% of people, I think, have an internet connection in their house. And so,
or maybe closer to like 90, 91 have broadband, which, you know, I don't know, depending on how often you get on.
Yeah, so in that case, maybe I could say we want to claim our survey is representative of the kinds of people who answer surveys, which, you know, so maybe we have an overestimate in that sense. If you assume that, let's say 93% of people have access to the technology in principle, you could subtract 7 percentage points off the base rate and just assume none of them, and then you could, you know, if we knew that were the case, we would do that. So I think maybe think about our data as a representative sample of people who have access to the internet. So that would be one reasonable way to look at it. Yeah, but that's why we're trying to do this benchmarking to subscriptions and other things. Yeah, it's a great question and one that I don't think any of us who do surveys have a satisfactory answer to. Okay, so so the other thing that's important is if we found imbalance, we didn't find that many imbalances. If we did, we can always weight the data to be representative of a bunch of things. So you can weight it not just on, when I say weight to moments, like you can weight it to the income distribution versus just average income. You can weight it to a lot of different things. If you're concerned, you can weight it to, you know, internet use or something like that in principle if you had that data. Okay, so let me just get into some results. So here's the first thing we did was, again, we didn't construct the sample to be representative of income. What we found is it very much was. So this is the distribution, this is the usual weekly earnings percentiles. And what you see is on the left, you see these unweighted earnings percentiles. They're very closely aligned without doing any weighting at all. So we find that the income distribution in the CPS and our survey, the RPS, is very similar, even though we didn't weight on it. And then when you see the weekly earnings weighting percentiles, you see the fit improves a little bit. That's just us actually weighting the data to be representative. We can also do the same thing for occupations. So we didn't weight on occupations, but we asked people the 2-digit occupation share. You can see the correlation between the share in our survey, the RPS, that's the vertical line, and the share in the CPS, the horizontal line. You see the unweighted correlation is 0.87. So most occupations are right on that line. We do have an oversample of management occupations. I actually think that part of that is the way that management occupations are measured in CPS data, which is if you are let's say you're a software developer and you manage a team of people, you don't call yourself a manager. The census doesn't call you a manager, but you might actually call yourself a manager or vice versa. So that's actually the hardest occupation to measure anyway. Having said that, we do have an oversample of them. And so you can see on the right, we just weight it. So you can see what we're doing is we're basically downweighting in our survey, in our answers, the people who report being managers. So you can just actually see how that's working. And by construction, the correlations, you know, it's basically it's not only one because of some small sample issues. So that's kind of what we're doing is we're taking the data, looking at the degree of imbalance, trying to figure out if maybe unobservables are a problem, even though we don't know for sure, and then weighting on anything we can observe. Okay, so how do we measure this? I'm going to show you the exact way we ask the questions, okay, because this is very important, how you measure generative AI use. So we say this is the prompt we give people. We say generative AI is a type of artificial intelligence that creates text, images, audio, or video in response to prompts. Some examples of generative AI include ChatGPT, Gemini, and Midjourney. Okay, so we thought it was important to split the difference between just asking people about do you use AI without defining it all versus just asking about a specific program. A lot of surveys ask just about ChatGPT, which is the most popular one. We want it to be more general, but we also didn't want people to think of like autocomplete on your phone as being an example of generative AI, even though in a strict sense it might be. Like there's a large language model behind that, but we want people to think of like artificial intelligence programs or software, like deliberate choices of use of programs. So we asked this question, and then after that we said, have you heard of it? Yes or no? If they have heard of it, do you use it for your job? Yes or no? And actually, a funny thing about this, we did no or yes, because in the first wave in June, we did yes or no, and the survey results were so high that we were worried. I thought this seems too high. And so we did a bunch of things in the August wave to make sure we weren't biasing us to get more yes answers, including switching from no to yes rather than yes to no, because there's some evidence that the ordering matters. So we did no to yes for that reason. And then we said, okay, if you use it, which of the following products do you use for your job? So this wasn't an abstract question, but do you ever use it, even if we actually asked people to select the things they used, and you can see that, and I'll show you in a second. So that's how we did it, and we did the order randomly, so there weren't order effects. And then finally we said, okay, after we asked them which ones, we said, did you use it for your job last week? And then we had a thing, did you use it for your job last week, yes or no? If you did you use it at least one workday? Did you use it every workday? Okay, so that's the way we asked the question. Any questions on that? Yes.
Yeah, a very simple one. Did you also ask some indirect questions to check whether workers were not aware they were using generative AI, but maybe they were using it? Or
no. No, and we basically decided, it's a good question, we decided that if people either said they've never heard of generative AI or said they don't use it after we gave this prompt, that the way they were using it was sufficiently indirect that we didn't want to count that as generative AI use. Yeah, so that was our judgment. You can imagine other ways, because I think the thing is, at some level, like when we do the survey in 2 years, it may be irrelevant because it's everywhere. Like it's kind of hard to avoid. Like when you Google something now, you get an AI-generated answer, so you're using generative AI in that sense. But we want to measure like people's intentional choice to use a product that is developed with generative AI. So that's why we designed the survey that way. Yeah. Okay. Yes, please.
Quick question. I use, let's say, Gemini to summarize my emails.
Yes.
Is that intended to be included?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you don't think the wording here creates text, audio? Yeah.
Well, so we're going to ask people a lot of questions about how they use it. So like if you use Gemini, one of the questions is interpreting, summarizing data. Like we say, like, how do you use AI? And then we ask them. So yeah. And I'll show you that in just a second. Okay, so here's the top line numbers. Okay, the share of people using AI, share of working adults using adults age 18 to 64. So overall, working age adults. So overall, in the survey, 39.4% of people said they had used generative AI. Of those, 10.9 plus 21.1, 32% said they used it at least once in the last week. Okay, that's at work or at home. The second row shows just work usage. You can see 28% of people said, yes, I use it at work. Of those, most said they've used it at least once in the last week, so 10.6 plus 13.6. So nearly a quarter of workers are saying I used it at least once in the last week, and about 1 in 9, 10.6%, say they used it every day last week. Okay. And you can see work usage outside of work is more common, but less intensive. So people are less likely to say they use it every day at home. And more likely that light blue bar are people who said, yes, I use it. But then when we asked them, did you use it last week? They said no. So it's kind of indeterminate. They've used it before. Maybe they used it last month, but not last week. Maybe they used it last year and not last week. We don't know. So depending on how you want to think about, are people, what share of people are users of AI? I would say it's probably at work, it's probably 24.2%. That is those two bars. Like if you used it at least once in the last week, I'd call you a user of AI. And at home, maybe it's 6.4 plus 19.5. But if you want to look at like people, users plus, let's say, experimenters, I think you'd want to look at the entire bar. That's how I'd look at it. And a key thing here is we're going to track this over time. So we want to know in our November survey, not just how do the top line numbers change, but how do the distributions change? Or is the share of regular users increasing? I think is an important indicator for where this is headed. Because there's a lot of people who've used it. I talk to my, honestly, like me, mostly middle-aged academic colleagues, people use it, but as a curiosity. It's like people aren't necessarily integrated into their workflow. So key question is, are you going to see an increased intensity of usage as well? We don't know yet. Okay, so that's the top line number. Now we asked about this is specific products. You can see Gemini there. You can see ChatGPT. So if you want to call some of these generative AI and not others, you could just literally subtract them from the numbers. Okay, so our number is 28.5% of people say they use generative AI. That's compared to 39.4% overall. So they use ChatGPT, so that's the most common one. We also have a category for what we call embedded products. The biggest one of those is Microsoft Copilot, but people could write in something if they wanted to. So we actually say embedded products, for example, Microsoft Copilot, or you can write in something else. Okay, so you can see the other is 3.5%. Want to take that out? People write in crazy stuff. Maybe you don't want to count that, but people can list more than one, and they do. Okay, so yeah, Eric.
Did you list any non-existent products?
That's a good question. No, but we could. We could and we should. That'd be fun to do. Yeah. Not November, it's too late, but maybe February. Okay. So how do our results compare to other estimates of AI? So there's not any other nationally representative estimates, but there are some other, whatever I'd call convenience samples surveys. And so one is the Pew survey, which is important because it's based on address. So they are in principle asking people who don't have internet connections, some of them, do you use AI? What they found was in February, 27% of adults age 18 to 64 had ever used ChatGPT. We find in August, 28.5% of adults ages 18 to 64 use ChatGPT. That's the use, but not necessarily last week. So that lines up pretty well. There's also a Reuters survey, which was online. This was conducted in April, and they asked people about ChatGPT also. They say 18% of all adults use it at least weekly. We find that in August, 19% of adults age 18 to 64, they had all adults, including retirees, used it last week. So those numbers are lined up pretty well. And then also we find pretty similar demographic patterns, which I'll show you in a second, across these surveys. And there's a paper by Anders Humlum and Emil Vestergaard looking at the usage of ChatGPT in specific occupations in Denmark. And we find very similar rates for those same occupations, although it's a bit hard to match the exact occupations across countries, but we do find similar patterns to those. So that gives us some confidence we're onto something. Okay, so how does it compare to past technologies? I guess is, in some sense, for me, the most interesting part of the paper. I hope it's interesting to you too. Because we ask these questions in the specific way and we use the CPS sampling frame, we can compare usage of generative AI to CPS surveys of usage of the internet and PCs. So the CPS asks questions about computer use and internet use, and we can date the speed of adoption relative to the first mass market product version of each. So for the PC, we're going to call that 1981, when the IBM PC was released. That was the first personal computer to sell more than 1 million units. So we're going to say that's the first mass market product for PCs. You can argue with that if you want, but that's our date. For the internet, we're going to pick 1995. That's when the NSF net was decommissioned and the internet was open to commercial use. And that's also the year that Netscape IPO'd. Okay, so and actually, I asked ChatGPT what are good dates for these, and these are the dates it chose as well. So we got some alignment on that. And then for generative AI, we're going to pick 2022 because that's when ChatGPT was released. Okay, so first mass market availability of each thing. And then we can use these data from the CPS to compare the speed of adoption across technology. So the CPS has something they call a computer and internet use supplement. And they ask, in various years from 1984 to 2003, do you use a computer for your job and do you use a computer at home? So for the computer, we have the home and we have the work and at home comparison. For the internet, we don't have that. We just have do you use internet at all? And we only have it in the CPS from 1997 to 2003, which is do you use the internet at any location? That's the question they asked. So we supplement that with data from the International Telecommunications Union, which is a partnership between a bunch of tech companies and the World Bank to try to collect data on global internet usage. And they're doing a mix of survey data when they have it, but also like actual broadband subscriptions and things like that. And their data is, what share of people use the internet from any location in the last 3 months. Okay, and that we have much more data. And I want to say, this is not a comparison of some platonic ideal of how good the technology is. You have to recognize that these things have built on each other very intentionally. So it's not possible to have the internet without PCs, and it's not possible to have generative AI without the internet. So it's not clear what the comparison means about the total impact of these technologies. I just want to present the data to you, and you can draw your own conclusions from it. Okay, so here's the figure. Here's the key figure. So the blue dot is our estimate, 39.4%. Okay, and then we're comparing that to the speed. This is, again, years since the first mass market product. So in year 2, it's 2024 now. ChatGPT was released in 2022, so we're 2 years beyond mass market release. The computer is 1981. The first CPS survey was 1984, so 3 years here the red square. And then for the 2 different internet surveys, we're dating it relative to 1995. Okay? So what you see is, 2 years after the first mass market product, generative AI has a higher adoption rate than either technology. And with time, we'll be able to trace up a line. Right now, what we have is a dot. But what you see is, the internet in particular was adopted very rapidly. By 1995, already 10% of people had it. By 2000, 40% were using the internet in the US. And by 2005, it was like 65%. So that's pretty rapid. And so if you think that, if you think this has some informational content, it suggests that probably 80%, just project this forward. If this even follows, the same slope, you could expect 80% of people to be using generative AI within a decade, if it follows the same path as past technologies. So again, I don't know what that means for its ultimate economic impact, but the way I would think about it is, think about how ubiquitous the personal computer or the internet are to society now. If I went back and I showed you that data back in 1984, what would you do differently? How would you foresee the world? Like whatever that is, it looks like right now generative AI is going to be like that. It's going to have the same kind of salience in everyday life that PCs and eventually that PCs and the internet do now. Yes.
So with respect to this comparison, I wonder whether we should factor in the fact that kind of the cost of adoption, right? Or the fact that some of these can have very experimental, gimmicky uses that might encourage like a one-off trial at the beginning.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. That's why we want to measure intensity of use over time. So like, let's say you're skeptical, like let's take out the experimenters and let's move the dot so that it's only people who used it in the last week. If you go back to that, like this is use at home and at work, so it's going to be something like high 20s. So that you're asking, I think, to move the dot down here, right? So like what share of people are using it, use it at least once in the last week? So that's still putting it ahead of the other two, but slightly more on par. And then I think the question is, how many people who use it even weekly now are still going to be using it weekly in a year? That's going to be the ultimate test. I agree. We don't know the answer to that question. Certainly the fact that it's relatively easy to use and it's relatively inexpensive has pushed the first dot higher. The question is does that mean you're getting more of the gains right away and it's going to flatline? Or does it mean the fact that these companies have made it so easy to use means it's going to be ubiquitous sooner? Like, I don't know the answer to that question. But it's a good one. Yeah, over here in the Eric, yeah. Oh, either one.
You're using your measure of intensity is, have you used it in the last week? And I understand that this is using old surveys. Here, in interpreting these 40%, it's totally imaginable that people use it for 5 minutes.
I have some data on intensity of use in the data.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Eric,
Each panel is a different set of people, so you can't see whether someone de-adopted.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, too bad.
But you could ask about it, but it'd be really interesting to see, like, the CPS has the same people.
No, not in these surveys. They do have the rotation groups, but not for this supplement. Yeah. But yeah, that's one thing we could do is we could ask people in surveys going forward, how much did you use it a few months ago? And see, have you used it? Do you use it more now than you did in the past? We could do some things like that. It's a good suggestion. Yeah. Okay, so I want to make one other point about this, which is part of it is that it's available at home, right? And I mean, the PC was too in principle, but we can't do this for the internet because we can't distinguish use at work and at home. But for the PCs, we could do that explicitly. And so what you see is that the work usage is actually pretty comparable to PCs. It's the home usage that's way higher. Okay, and that, to your question, is probably to do with the fact that a PC costs several $1,000s in today's terms, and the internet is, this ChatGPT subscription is $20 a month, or even free. You can use the free version. So I want to just be super clear about this. It's still quite high, but it's lower if you're just thinking about work adoption. It's not quite as far above. Okay, but again, like I don't know what the right numbers are. I think the point of this is that there's a good chance it's on the same scale as these things that we now see as like an integral part of our everyday lives. I think that's really the main point. Okay, so how much are people using it? This is your question. Here's how we did it. So, and we've actually made more detailed categories in the newer wave, so we can get finer grained measures of usage intensity. What we've done is we've asked people, when on the days you use it, do you use it less than 15 minutes a day? That's the light bar. Do you use it between 15 minutes and an hour, or do you use it more than an hour a day? So what I'm showing you here is the unconditional first for all people who use it at work. It's pretty mixed. About a quarter use it 15 minutes or less. Half of them use it between 15 minutes and an hour, and a quarter use it more than an hour a day. And then I'm showing you by, this is the cross product of how much you use it on the days you use it versus how many days do you use it. All right. And so what we can do is we can take these two together and multiply them to get an estimate of the share of all work hours that are spent assisted by generative AI. And there's some bars on that because 15 to 60 minutes, you don't know whether it's 15 or 60. So what we do is take the upper and lower limits of those questions, and we multiply that out. We get an estimate that between 1 and 9% of all work hours in the US are currently spent using generative AI. Between 1 and 9%. So I don't know whether you think that number is big or small. I'm not sure what I think. But it's a number that I think is useful, and you can use that. I'll show you in a second. You can kind of use that directly in some potential, I would say, speculative calculations about the productivity impacts. So we're definitely doing more of this. We want to try to calculate this number and the ranges over time and see if it's increasing or decreasing. No, I think we did. No, I think we did. I forget. I think we did something less than that. We did like 4 hours or 3 hours or something like that. Yeah.
Will you repeat your comment? Thank you.
My question was,
Yeah.
9%, is it based on assuming that the people who use it 60 plus minutes per day used it all day?
No. I think we picked 3 hours. I'm forgetting exactly to the paper. I think we picked some reasonable number over that, but not all the time. Yeah.
And since I have the microphone,
Yeah.
what are people doing with it at home?
I'm gonna. Well, I don't have that in the deck. People are using it to help them write, both at work and at home. People are searching up travel. They're making travel plans. They're searching for recipes. They're searching for home improvement tips. I think there are a lot of people here who probably know more about this than me. I think I would, when I use it at home, I use it like a Google that you can talk to. So it's like, I want to know something, give me some information. No, that's not quite right. Tell me this instead. I actually walk around with the voice thing, and I use it kind of like an interactive Alexa. No, that's not what I want. Tell me this. And then so I think there's a lot of use to improve consumer welfare, but not necessarily to increase productivity.
You're like this story. So Bengt Holmstrom was here last week, and he tells me every morning he has a 1-hour tutoring session with ChatGPT on all sorts of different. He showed me all the dialogues he had with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we have in our paper, you can see what people say. Yeah, but I'll show you the work one in a second.
I have a question. I think just want to validate your labor market. You talk about this U.S. generally. So I wonder whether the people are they just not knowledge worker, or are they just normal people?
I'm going to show you that in a second.
Okay.
On occupations. Yeah, just 1 second. So that's who's using it, how are they using it? All right. So first, by demographics. So by education, educated people, if you have a bachelor's degree or more, you're about twice as likely to use generative AI. Okay. And that's the blue bars. The red bars are how that compares to computer use in the current population survey in 1984. So we can compare the two technologies. The bottom line is they're very similar by education and age. Young people use it more, and educated people use it more, but they're different by gender, actually. So men are more likely than women to use a generative AI, but women were more likely than men to use the PC. That's because the PC was adopted first by a lot of office work, especially secretaries and administrative assistants, which is a heavily female occupation. So that way goes the opposite. For the other two, it's very similar. And also, this is the question by occupation groups. So you can take a picture, but don't worry, the slides will be posted online, so you can see it later if you want. This is by 2-digit occupation codes. And what you see here is, it's not surprising in a sense that the heaviest users are computer and mathematical occupations, and then managers and business. Those are high-skilled professional, knowledge work. But I think the point I draw from this is that actually use is pretty ubiquitous across other occupation groups. So for example, blue collar, this is people who work in construction, manual labor, installation, maintenance and repair, manufacturing. A quarter of them, 22%, I should say, are using AI. And if you add 9 plus 7, you're saying 16%, or about 1 in 6 say they used it at least once in the last week, blue collar workers. So it's actually fairly frequently used across a variety of occupations. That's what I take away from this figure. And we have some stuff in the paper comparing that to the PCs, and PCs were actually much more heavily concentrated in certain occupations, whereas generative AI is spread more broadly across them. So the other thing we can look at is there are these measures, like Ellen Du et al. Have this paper trying to compute exposure to AI by tasks. They're basically asking what are the tasks that AI could substitute for as a way to measure which occupations are at greatest risk of being replaced by AI. And so we take their measure, and then we relate it to actual AI use. And the correlation between those two things is 0.67. So they're very highly related. The people who The Elendu et al. Taxonomy says are heavily exposed to AI are actually the same occupations that are using it a lot. And what you see is the income gradient in exposure. This is their predicted AI exposure on the vertical axis, and then log earnings on the y-axis, so high earning occupations, low earning occupations on the left. What you can see is that pattern is the same. It's basically those people are using it more and they're more exposed, but then there's a little bit of a dip down because the highest skilled work, like managers, CEOs, executives, are not using it as much, and they're the highest paid. So you see the exact same pattern with exposure and use. Okay, and then I think this is the last result on this, and this is which tasks do you find the most useful? So the way we do this is we give people this list of things. We say, do you use AI for this? Yes or no? And then we say, now we're going to ask you to rank which of these tasks, the ones you said you use AI for, so let's say they picked 4 out of 10, rank which ones you found the most or least useful. And then I'm telling you the share of them that will report is one of the 2 most useful. It's just a way to give you a sense of what are the things people are reporting they're using it most for. By far, the biggest is writing. This is also true for use at home. Performing administrative tasks, kind of vague. We're trying to dig into that a little bit in the latest survey wave. Interpreting, translating, or summarizing. This is like not writing emails, but like, summarizing your daily emails would be interpreting, translating, and summarizing information. Searching for facts, kind of like using it like Google. Software coding, documentation, developing new ideas. You can see it. There's a lot of different uses people select. It's not just for a few things. So you put this together with the occupation data, and like my sense of this is that whatever we think is a general purpose technology, this seems to satisfy a lot of those criteria because it's being used by a lot of different people to do a lot of different things. So it's very general. It's not targeted, at least not right now. As we get more data, we'll figure out where is the most intense use happening and what types of tasks and so on. Okay, so possible labor market impacts of AI. I think it's really too early to say how is this going to affect work concretely. It's only been around a couple of years. I think there's 2 ways you can get around that. One is to try to make a forecast based on Holton's theorem. What is Holton's theorem? It's basically how much more productive does this new technology make you in certain tasks, multiplied by how common those tasks are as a share of all tasks done in the US economy. So it's an accounting exercise. Doron Asimoglu does this in one way. He says, look, he takes the 20% occupation exposure share from this Elendu et al. Paper, multiplied by the share of tasks that another paper thinks can be automated in those jobs, so 20% times 23%, and gets an automation task share of 4.6%. So that's like the exposure-weighted share of all things that people do on the job that can be replaced by AI. And then you multiply that by the labor cost savings in those tasks. So then he takes evidence from a bunch of different experimental studies where you give people generative AI, including one by Eric and co-authors, where you give people generative AI and you see how much more productive it makes you. And the average estimate across those is 27%, makes you 27% more productive. So then you multiply that times the labor share, times 0.57, what share of all activity is labor, and you get 15.4%. And then you multiply 4.6% times 15.4%, and you get that it could plausibly generate total factor productivity growth increases of about 0.7 of a percentage point over 10 years. That's the Asimoglu et al. Approach. This is me just explaining it to you in a slide, in case you haven't read the paper. Okay, so that's what he does. That's why I say it's an accounting exercise, but it's an interesting one. Now, the other interesting thing about it is that we can do the same thing in our data, and we get a pretty similar answer. So we say, if it's 1 to 9% of all work hours, and then we take that 27% and we multiply it times the 1 to 9% range, we get an estimate of an increase in labor productivity of between 0.3 and 2.4%. And then if you multiply that by the labor share, you get a range between 0.2 and 1.4. In the middle of that is like 0.7, right? So by both approaches, you're getting a plausible answer. But maybe this is an unsatisfying answer because it's kind of the narrow way that AI would improve productivity, not like generating new jobs and generating new possibilities. It's all just like taking what we're doing and seeing if we did it better with AI, what impact would it have? So that's one way to do this. The other way, which I want to show you briefly about in our remaining time, is to just study not how the AI is affecting work in the future or how we think it will, but how it's already affected the job market. Okay. And the way I'm going to do that is to show you how firm investments in AI have shaped the economy already. Okay, so this is not the effects of AI on work itself. This is the effect of investment in AI on who gets hired and how the job market changes. So a couple things on that. One is there's been a huge investment boom in the US, like a historic investment boom in the US over the past decade. So this is from the paper with Chris and Larry, where we look at the share of GDP spent by private companies in information processing and software. You can see the dot-com boom and bust in the blue line there around 2001. and then this is R&D. What you see is that R&D as a share of GDP is at historic highs. It's almost 3% of GDP currently being spent on R&D. And that's a run, you can see it's increasing, but like see the run up here, starting around 2010, it's basically increased by 30 to 35% in a decade. Share of all GDP spent on R&D. And if you look at occupations, you can actually see that already the job market is changing. So I want to draw your attention to the bottom line. This is science, technology, engineering, and math occupations. So if you know the occupation codes, it's SOC codes 15, 17, and 19. That's engineers, computer and mathematical occupations, and science occupations. What you see is they've gone from about 6 to 6.5% of all jobs in the US economy in 2012, 2013, to more than 10% today. That's a 50% increase in the share of all jobs in the US economy that are STEM over the last decade. And this is not some law of nature that job share increases. In fact, the previous decade, 2000 to 2012, it actually shrank as a share of all jobs in the US economy. So you can see already in the data, the AI investment boom. These are big companies making huge investments in technical talent and making huge investments in information processing and R&D. It's already visible. So AI is already directly affecting the labor market. Yes? Yeah, good question. I'm going to show you that in a second, actually. Hold that thought. Yeah, exactly. These are shares. So something has to be decreasing if it's increasing. Okay. Again, since 2010, big increases in private spending on information processing software and R&D. STEM employment and shares increased a ton. I showed you the business, it went by quickly. If you look, actually, I'm going to go back. I'll show you the business and management share. The top line, you can all see is also increasing very rapidly. What are those jobs? Well, when you look under the hood at that category, it's actually a lot of what I would describe as quant business jobs. It's jobs like management analysts, business operations specialists. And so what you can see is a lot of evidence, circumstantial evidence, but evidence in the data that jobs are changing in a way to adapt to the coming AI boom. So then this is the question, what about job displacement? I'm going to show you a little bit of evidence for creative destruction in retail occupations. Okay, this is an active project I'm working on now, so I'll kind of just show you what I hope is like figure 1 and 2 of the eventual academic paper. Okay, so this is a plot of monthly, this is from the Census Bureau, this is a plot of monthly sales by non-store retailers over the last 8 years, coming from US Census data. So this is total sales in the industry code of non-store retailers. This is online, this is e-commerce, basically. What you see is it's been increasing, and if you were to go back, you know, Eric's done some work on this himself, it goes back along, it's been increasing for a long time, so e-commerce has been around a long time. But you can see this incredible jump, basically a decade of progress in a month during the pandemic. And then notably, it doesn't revert back, it keeps growing. So you see this 1 month huge spike that continues to grow. So how is that affecting retail trade occupation? So to get a sense of that, I just did something very simple, which is I'm cracking open the occupational employment statistics of the BLS and looking at 2 occupations that are plausibly substitutes for each other in the economy. One is, do you work in retail sales occupations? Like, are you a retail store worker? Are you a cashier? Things like that. And the other one is food service. So are you a waiter? Are you, you work in what they call food service counter workers? It's basically like not cooks, but like fast food workers. So you work in food service, food processing kind of thing, like customer facing. What you see is both were, you know, growing. And actually, if I could go back, OES only goes back to 2011. If you go back farther, you could see they're growing at a similar pace up until the early 2000s. And then retail starts to slow a little bit. Food service is growing fast. And they both dip tremendously in the pandemic. And actually, food service drops even more than retail sales. So you're seeing, like, this is number of jobs. So you go from, you know, 6.5 million jobs in food service to less than 5 million right after the pandemic. So a huge drop in food service jobs. But then it recovers. It's now back up almost to 6 million. So it's not quite to where it was before the pandemic, but it's on that path. Retail never recovered. The US economy now has 1 million fewer retail sales jobs than it did in 2019, over a period in which the economy overall was adding 19 million jobs. So when you, this is to your question, when you put that into shares, what you see is the employment share in retail sales occupations is just plummeting. It's gone from 7.5% in the mid-2000s to 5.6% today. And this is one of the largest occupation categories in the US. Okay. So obviously we don't know how much of this is AI directly. Probably what's happened is that, you know, as we all know, like before generative AI, AI technologies were a big part of the success of e-commerce giants like Amazon, who are using what you might think of as predictive AI to optimize inventory management, using computer vision techniques to figure out how to send their little Kiva robots across the factory floor and move products around, figure out what products to recommend to you, how to get things to you faster. And so probably what's happening, my preferred story, is that this technology has actually been better in some ways than shopping in person for a long time, but the pandemic shocked people out of their normal purchasing behavior. And then you said, hey, I'm ordering these things online. It's pretty good. Why go back? And so retail never recovered. So you could think about a big shock like the pandemic accelerating AI-fueled progress in creative destruction in retail. Okay, and then you see this also has been relating to growth in retail trade productivity in the sector. So these firms are becoming more productive. All right, so this is my last slide. So are we at the beginning of the AI boom? Probably not, just statistically, but maybe. The origin of this project, Larry Summers and I were working on this project actually a long time ago, and we had computed this measure of what we call churn. So it's how much is the job market changing over periods of time as a way to systematically look at, are things changing faster than ever? Because there was this narrative, as there has been for a long time, that things are changing so fast. And we did this in 2017, and we found actually that the 2000 to 2015 period was one of the most stable periods in the US job market in history since 1880. And that's in the paper. And so we kind of patted ourselves in the back and said all these people who are saying everything's different this time are wrong. And so we had the opportunity to write this paper over the summer, and we thought we'll just crack open the same methodology and do the same thing again. And we found we still found the same thing we found 7 years ago, so we were able to replicate our own results. But when you look at the pace of occupational change in the job market since the pandemic, it's actually faster than at any period since the 1970s. So that's why I say, but maybe. I actually had my priors moved by looking at some of these trends I showed you and thinking, actually, we may be facing a time of more rapid disruption in the labor market than we've seen, certainly since I've been alive. Maybe. We'll see. So how does that affect, thinking about this in the big picture, there's a lot of studies that show small impacts of labor productivity. I'd say 25% is great if you could scale it up, but it's kind of purposely designed for particular tasks the AI can do. When you multiply it out times the number of things that AI can't do, that's when you get numbers like Theyron Acemoglu's that say this could be a big impact, but it's not going to be game-changing. I think an important part of those studies to keep in mind is that a lot of them have this finding that they bring up the lower skilled people more. So AI is pretty good at getting you to the average, but not as good at making you more of an expert if you're already an expert. And that's kind of a hopeful story for inequality. On the other hand, there's some recent evidence, there's a couple of papers I cite here, that AI could increase inequality. And it tends to increase inequality in situations that are more open-ended. So like AI use in the wild, use it for whatever you want. People who are more skilled tend to find better uses for the AI. And this Tona Rogers paper is a great example of how AI supercharges scientific discovery, but does it more for people who are more skilled at baseline. Okay. So I think all of this is, and I think if you think about how AI is affecting, a whole other topic, how AI is affecting learning, I think it's pretty worrying what's happening on college campuses, probably including Stanford, I know including Harvard. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how this will ultimately redound into change. And it's probably going to take a lot longer. So that's my possible labor market impacts of AI. I think something's definitely happening, but how fast it will happen and in which direction it will go, I don't think we know yet. Thanks.
We have time for some questions.
Thanks. Two thoughts. One, just a quick thought that I hadn't thought of until last night. Your last point about how it's disrupting education.
Yeah.
Somebody pointed out something last night that I hadn't thought of, which may or may not be true, that soon we'll be able to use AI to give oral exams, and then we'll have turned the corner completely and we'll be okay. I don't know if that's going to be true. That probably take longer than we think, but it does make some sense in theory. But the first half of your paper was obviously very focused on generative AI, the first half of your talk in the first paper. The second part, the relationship to AI became a bit more tenuous.
Mm-hmm.
So you were showing us a lot of data, but if I just thought of business analytics or of engineering or coding instead, and you were sort of putting all the emphasis on AI, how much, did I miss something about the connection being stronger than you think, or do you have reasons to think that it is more AI than I might have thought? I mean, your conclusions are broadly what I would have meet my priors.
Okay,
I'm
good.
I'm not fighting. But
that's what I was going for, Paul, so I'm glad. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think you're right. The connection is more tenuous, and I think I intended for that to be true. I don't think it's obvious that it's just AI, and also it depends on, I think, what you mean by AI. I think a lot of people, AI has come to mean generative AI to a lot of people, but I mean, I've been around long enough to know there was a whole literature, like there was an economics of AI MBR program before ChatGPT ever came out. So there's a whole bunch of studies looking at predictive AI. The idea that like basically big data analytics allow you to make better predictions about things, which allow you to augment, you know, so there's a whole, so I was trying to bring some of that in, and there's a big literature actually on AI in retail in particular. So I was trying to bring that in, but I recognize the connection's not as clean, and it's like intermediated by a lot of different things. So it's like AI plus huge capital investments, you know, from like Amazon's basically not making a profit for years because they were making huge investments in these technologies, and there's, you know, zero interest rate phenomenon that makes that possible. There's a lot of other things going into the mix besides just plopping the technology down onto an economy. But that's why it's macro and not micro. But yeah, so I was trying to say, well, look, hey, if you think there's, I guess one way to think about it is, if you're predisposed to thinking this might, hey, maybe the ground's moving under our feet, maybe this time really is different, I'm going to give you a little bit of grist for that mill, but I'm not going to go all the way and say it's definitely happening. That's kind of the vibe I was going for.
Thank you. I read A Second Machine Age.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
More than 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And so where are we now? I know where it is in the second half of the chess game. So,
I don't know how to answer that. You know, on a day-to-day basis, things don't feel so different, right? On the other hand, I think about, you know, like, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we didn't have computers or phones or anything. And like these technologies have a way of becoming omnipresent in our lives without us ever realizing it. So the future I'm trying to imagine, and probably not doing any better of a job than you or anybody else, is trying to imagine a world where generative AI is so ubiquitous that even asking these questions makes no sense. Like it's just everywhere, and how that's going to change what we do. And my guess is it's probably going to do it a little bit at a time from our human perspective. And I tend to resist explanations that like there's going to be some moment where everything changes. I think it's more like the frog boiling in the pot, that like it's going to gradually change us in ways that we only perceive in retrospect clearly. I'm not, that sounds ominous. I don't know if it's bad or good. I just think like one thing I think I learned from studying the history of technological change is that it just takes much longer, even when you can see the future. Like, you know, Michael Faraday discovered the principle of electromagnetic energy generation in 1831. Thomas Edison patented the incandescent light bulb in 1880, but it wasn't until 1930 that the US economy was electrified. So like everybody knew it was a big deal when, you know, Edison starts this big power plant in New York City. At that time, people who were paying attention probably thought this is it, but actually, and it was it, but it just took half a century. And so I kind of think that's going to be the case too with AI. I don't think we're going to have some combinatorial explosion. Maybe we will, but seems unlikely, but I do think it'll change things fundamentally.
Going back to the comparison with other disruptive technologies like and the personal computer, I was wondering if you think that there would be anything interesting to learn from comparing it to technologies that were similarly very hyped at the beginning, but then ended up not really panning out, right? Like you're kind of selecting on successful examples. It's hard to come up with things that were this hyped and then did not end up in like success. I asked ChatGPT, didn't come up with like good examples. Maybe like internet portals in the 90s. Then a version of that would be like, well, if we are in an AI boom or at the beginning of an AI boom, will we end up at a dot-com bubble too, right?
Yeah. And I also think, by the way, we could very well have an AI, you know, I mean, if you look at the dot-com bubble, it was a bubble, but like the trend persisted. So like we're probably going to have something like that at some point in the future. Nobody knows when. We probably will have an AI bust, but that doesn't necessarily mean it won't be a big deal. I think comparing it to other technologies, it'd be interesting to do. I mean, certainly there's been hype for a lot of different things. I don't know, maybe blockchain is one relatively recent one. So I don't know how we would do that. What we were really doing is just comparing it to the only other two technologies that have CPS data on them, which I think agree is selecting on success in some sense, although they were, you know, the fact they did a PC survey in 1984 suggests that there's a pretty early indicator. Same thing for the internet. I think we're probably going to know pretty soon whether it's really a bust. Like I think if you were to invite me back in 2 or 3 years and we have the same numbers that we do, I would say, yeah, it's probably going to be a bust. So like I'd be willing to stake that in advance, because what you see with the internet in particular, but also PCs, is the adoption curve stayed pretty steep for several years after. So there's an initial big bump, and then it stayed steep for a while because people were like, wow, this is really amazing. I have to start using it. And it's TBD whether that'll be true for Gen AI.
It was really interesting to see how you compared the actual use to the Elandu et al. Projected use. And you highlighted there's a high correlation, but also inevitably there were places where they differed. I don't know how closely you remember or looked at. I'd be very curious what isn't panning out as much as they thought, and conversely, where is it happening faster than they thought? Is there anything we can learn from those differences?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric. I'll point out one thing that springs to mind. So one is we found very low usage in office and administrative support occupations. And that's something where like business process automation is already happening. Like those jobs, if I had to bet, I would say those are the jobs that are going to be replaced first. And so it might be that the usage is low because instead of teaching people how to use the technology at work, you're just like sending it to the Philippines and then eventually sending it to the
So like, if it's high enough, the number's zero, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that may be what's going on with something like that. I was surprised at the usage in, I mean, blue collar is a bad term, but like occupations where you do a lot of work in the physical world. I was surprised by that. I think it's almost certainly a complementarity story. So it's like in the same way that, and maybe you guys are measuring this, like the welfare gains of being able to search anything on YouTube about how to fix your house. It's like really hard to measure, but super important. Like I'm a homeowner, I'm not that handy. I can find anything about how to fix something. And like, that's a huge welfare gain. I think a lot of it is that it's like, I can actually get some quick instructions or quick guidance on how to do some work in the physical world, but it doesn't mean the AI is ever going to do that job. It's just going to make me better at it. So I find that to be kind of a hopeful story that's off the diagonal. Yeah.
Hello. So question. Imagine that we're going through hypothetically an AI boom right now.
Yeah.
Just like we did with computers and with the internet.
Yeah.
How should I invest my time and my money to most profit from the coming boom?
Well, good question. First of all, if I really knew the answer, I'd be doing it and not talking about it. So take my advice with a grain of salt. I mean, I think on the investment level, like where should you put your money? I don't know that I have anything to say that's smarter than what anybody else would say. I'll instead choose to focus on the how should I be investing in myself, or how should I be spending my time? I think, I've heard other people, this is almost a cliche, I've heard many people say it, but I really think it's true, which is that the risk is not that AI will replace you, it's that somebody who knows how to use AI better than you will replace you. And so I think you kind of have to figure out how to use it to make yourself more productive. Like there's no getting around it. So I think I would say you don't necessarily need to be an expert with it, but understand what it does and integrate it into your work. My short answer, the way I use it, is anything I know I'm going to have to do more than once, I try to find a way to incorporate AI into it because of the time savings. I'm just doing it once, it's not really worth it.
Time for one quick question online. I want to give the folks. So from our friend Yoshavit, he asks, what are some reasons to expect different and similar adoption rates compared to past technologies? Like, is it even possible that nearly 100% of the people who would ever use AI are already using it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a reason to expect that the adoption is faster than it otherwise would be was because the choice that companies like OpenAI made to create a consumer-facing version of it. I mean, in some ways, these LLMs have been around a lot longer. The real innovation was making it easy to use. I mean, it's some combination of innovation and adoption and ease of adoption. So I would say that's a reason to say this is overstated relative to past technologies. On the other hand, the IBM PC was kind of the same thing. We had computers for a long time. It's like, now let's make something that the everyday person can use. And so I think the lesson I take from that is the long run rate of adoption is going to be just as dependent on what the private sector does to make it easy to use as it is on the technological capabilities itself.
Well, thank you, David. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sorry that we're out of time, but I appreciate you coming to join us for this special seminar.
Oh, thanks. It was great. My pleasure. Thank you.
And our next seminar is on December 2nd, when Peter Diamandis is going to be talking about the need to up-level human mindset and objectives for the coming age of abundance. So we know where he is on that.
Yeah, that's right.
So we'll see you hopefully on December 2nd. Thanks very much.